Everybody who talks about space settlement loves to use historical analogies, and everybody loves to talk about Jamestown, Mayflower Pilgrims, Transcontinental Railroad, etc. But mostly, when they use this, these are talking, basically inventing fairy stories. You're cherry picking the points you want, and you're using it for particular reasons. And this is something that's done by both the advocates and the opponents of space settlement, because opponents like to say, well, there was this dystopian aspect of past colonization, and you're just going to replicate this in space. There's no particular reason why that would be true, because the drivers aren't there, because people have not delved into the history in some point. So what I'm saying is we need to look at especially the recent historiography, which has been a good deal more, a lot has been found out about the past in the last couple decades. And if you're not up on that research, you're going to use the analogies wrongly. One thing that always bothers me is the idea that its settlement is the hunt for the great exportable back to the metropole. Everyone gets into Jamestown and the tobacco trade and all this, and the idea that, for instance, North America gets used all the time as the example. So that's what is worth looking at.
I don't think the mic's working. Well, the mics are just for video.
Oh, okay.
There is no mic. Yeah.
All right, so I will speak louder, especially for the old folks in the audience around. Yeah, there's the idea that the English colonies in North America were primarily an agricultural export, re-exporting tobacco back to the metropole. That is the model that was used with sugar in the Caribbean. It was used in some of the southern colonies. But the fact is that the northern colonies began manufacture pretty much immediately after the settlement began. The Jamestown, the Mayflower Pilgrims landed in Plymouth in 1620. By 1621, they were manufacturing ships for local use, using in situ resources, and also making what were called then naval stores, the consumables which wooden sailing ships used in large quantities. In England, they had to import them from the Scandinavian countries because they didn't have the ecology for it. But New England had the ecology for these naval stores, so they began processing them immediately and selling them to maritime customers, and particularly the large fishing fleets that were already in operation off the New England coast even before settlement. So by the time of the American Revolution, according to Peter Hugel, who studied the issue, 40% of the ships in the British merchant fleet were built in North America. And this didn't show up in standard economic histories until Hugel published that, because economic historians relied almost entirely on customs records from the UK, because even internal trade paid a revenue tariff. And what will happen is that, like, Connecticut and Massachusetts farmers would build ships over the winter when they couldn't farm, just in little local creeks turned into shipyards, and in the spring they launched the ship, they loaded them with some crops and sailed it to England, and then they sold the ship. And the import of the grain was recorded, and they had to pay revenue tariff on it. The ship was not considered a transaction, so there was no central record store of these transactions. Yet 40% of the British merchant fleet was quite a large manufacturing industry. They were also more competitive than the British shipyards, because the British shipyards were all controlled by the shipbuilders' guilds, and they were required to use obsolete technologies. The New England farmers were more competitive. They used, for instance, iron nails as fasteners, where the British craft guilds required the use of wooden fasteners in the ships. So the American ships were both cheaper and better. They were like the equivalent of Japan or China in the maritime construction trade until the Revolution, which then put a damper on that trade. Anyway, the point is, you can't just build a simple fairy tale out of some half-remembered history. You have to look at what actually happened. So I am currently writing a book on the history of the commercial launch industry, being something that I was personally involved in from about 1980 onwards. And what I'm most concerned about is how people in the launch business, both the government and the emerging commercial sector, what mental models they had about what they were doing. At the beginning, I'm not sure what you get. NASA and the military launched satellites. They did not consider that they were in the transportation business. They were doing an activity to support scientific research or for national defense purposes. I kind of call this the polar support model because they weren't trying to find customers. As a matter of fact, when the first commercial ComSat venture started, actually NASA was quite resistant to the idea that a private enterprise should launch into space, but John Kennedy was pro-commercial in that sense, and he saw that ComSat and then Intelsat were created to get at least a nominally private enterprise into space, and that meant the government had to start launching commercial customers. And they didn't even call it a launch business, they just called it reimbursable launch. The idea that this was a special favor the government was doing to the private sector, and the private sector would reimburse the costs of the government. This lasted throughout the 60s and into the early 70s when people realized, well, this is a transportation activity and we have to rationalize it for cost effectiveness, which led to the space shuttle. And the space shuttle basically put the government in the spaceline business. But they were really resistant to it. So after the Challenger incident, the government turned to the old contractors who had the Atlas and the Titan and the Delta, the private launchers, and set up what was de facto a government-endorsed national champion carrier. They were very similar to like the nationalized airlines in Europe or Pan American before deregulation. But the first entrepreneurs came along and they were basically saying, well, we're going to transition to a competitive airline model. So instead of being like Pan Am as a government-sheltered, government-sponsored activity, we're going to be competitive, we're going to lower costs by innovation, et cetera. And in fact, this was the only model that the venture capitalists were interested in supporting. I go into this in a good deal in the book because I was part of those negotiations. But we get to the transcontinental railroad model, which most people focus on because of the fact that it was at the beginning subsidized, and there were the land grants, which people saw as another form of subsidy and transfer. But actually, it was a rational move on the part of the government because it created value in lands that previously had no economic value to the government. And the government ended up making a huge, well, I wouldn't say profit because it's a government activity, but a huge return positively for that. And you have to understand that the railroad companies that built the transcontinental railroads were not primarily in the transportation business. They were primarily in the development business. They were building, they saw that farmers were recruited and brought over. They saw that the mines and the mills and the factories along the line were built. It was the same way that a skyscraper developer puts elevators in for the purpose of building value in the upper stories. And they don't try to charge fares and make a profit off of charging a fare for an elevator ride. So that model, when you understand, it's not primarily about the subsidies, it's primarily about being in the value building business, it's ultimately what the entrepreneurs starting from the 80s wanted to do, but they couldn't tell the story in public because of venture capital prejudices against it. Well, basically, the venture capital did not believe in price elasticity, and the entrepreneurs did. So we come to Elon Musk, and a lot of people say, all right, well, Elon's not making a profit off of its launches. He's never going to recover the development costs for Starship. That will be true if he goes ahead with his plans to build a city on Mars. Elon is the first person who is actually following the Transcontinental Railroad model in its true form. So a lot of people sort of think, well, he built a nice business launching satellites. He should have stuck to that. Now he's on this Mars kick as a sort of a personal eccentricity. That's wrong. He understands the model properly, and he's doing what is necessary to make that work. SpaceX may not actually be truly profitable until the 2050s or something, and Elon doesn't care. So he's not crazy, well, at least on this topic, he's not crazy. He's right about that. He understands the model. And this is all explained at much greater length in my book. Thank you.
Thank you so much.